more on this. Let's speak to another struggle veteran of South Africa, Trevor Manuel, the former minister, joining us tonight from Cape Town, I believe, sir. Good evening. Thank you so much for your time. So there are these renewed calls for another inquest into the assassination of Chris Hani. Do you think there's still much truth to be learned about the circumstances of his killing?
Good evening to you, Mpototo, and to your viewers. Look, there's so much about Chris's assassination that the world doesn't know. And with the passing of, I'm trying to remember his name, the other assassin.
Clive Derby-Lewis, I think.
Clive Derby-Lewis, I think a lot died with that. Because there was also some evidence that his wife, who was a journalist, had a kind of hit list, and Chris was top of that hit list. So there were issues involved, and we must get to the bottom of it, and we must get to find out who the assassins were. But you know, given the efflux of time, it's 30 years today. It's a big period. I think it's very important to recognize that even if the inquest is held, and even if we know who the people are, and we should know, and our criminal justice cluster must be able to produce these results, it's most important that we focus on Chris and his contribution in the 50 years that he was alive and the largest part of that as an activist, and what was taken from us. And I think that's so important. Those of us who were privileged to have contact with Chris knew him as a strong-willed but rational, clear thinker, and one who earned the trust of everybody he came into contact with. Now, part of earning that trust, Mpototo, was his leadership style. He was always in the trenches with people. He was with the first Lutuli detachment, and he was young. As a guerrilla, when things were going wrong in the ANC in the 60s, he was one of those who mobilized for the conference at Morogoro, which I think everybody accepts was fundamentally important in re-energizing the ANC and uniting it. And that point was in 1969, and Chris was young. He was but 27 when he played that formidable role. And through the later years, he was in Soweto in the 70s before the Soweto uprising, and he remained contact, and everybody knew that Chris was right on the ground and leading the troops when there were issues in the camps in the 80s and there was a risk of mutiny. Chris was again very directly involved, and he was trusted because he didn't ask of anybody to do the things that he himself would not do as a revolutionary in struggle. And after the unbanning, after his formal return home, I think that we got to see a quality of leadership in Chris, and I want to pick out one example from that. In 1990, the first talks took place at Kruterskir in May. The second was called the Pretoria Minute in August of that year. And one of the agreements at the Pretoria Accord was that there would be a cessation of hostilities. Initially, Chris was very angry about this because there were so many lives at risk. There were many of the cadres who were still in prison. There were people who were underground. There were arms caches about the country. And he thought that it's not correct for the ANC to take a decision unless there'd been a process of consultation and with the people who were most at risk. Mm-hmm. And he asked the ANC NEC to hold off so that he could go and consult. And when he came back from those consultations, he was able to report that there's still a lot of anger amongst comrades, but he's been able to calm this so that we could move to the next phase of struggle, which then laid the basis for the formal negotiations that started at later that year. But it was Chris, and Chris on the ground, who was a formidable leader and one who earned respect and wasn't accorded respect because of the positions he held.
And it wasn't it, the potential of the country tipping into civil war upon his murder in 1993 that was testament to Chris Hani's weight in the struggle for South Africa's liberation. Yet 30 years on, you have to wonder why it is that it seems enough hasn't been done to pursue the truth in its fullest when you consider just the pain felt by the Hanis, the ANC and the nation as a whole at his loss.
Look, I mean, I think it's also important, Mkhototo, to focus just on that period. He was assassinated on the 10th of April 1993. The 11th of April, for the very first time, Nelson Mandela could say to F.W. de Klerk, who was president, step aside, let me address the nation on national television. And so effectively you had a de facto shifting of power, but it's because the nation had come out so strongly on the death of Chris Hani. And let's just remind ourselves that 2 weeks to the day later, South Africa lost another giant, Oliver Reginald Tambo. So Hani and Tambo in the month of April in 1993 was a major, major loss. But it was Chris's presence, his charisma, his leadership style, his forward-looking nature, and his ability to listen and persuade that was so instrumental in convening a movement that didn't know age. I mean, we were fairly young then, but Chris understood that even at Morogoro he was very young, but he didn't see age as an impediment. He convened people and listened to points of view, but was always able to take decisions, the decisions that needed to be taken.
And there have been multiple theories about whether Chris Hani was killed by the apartheid security branch, at its instruction, I beg your pardon, or foreign interference in his killing, some have suggested, but there have also been fingers pointing or speculation that it may have been, in fact, some of his own comrades in the movement who betrayed him. Can we write that third one off as far as the possibilities around what happened in 93?
Look, there are things that we can't write off. There are things that we will never know until the truth is heard about it. Janus Wallus was visited in prison by a former president of this country. We don't know what the meeting was about. It's also true that certain of the operators of Vlakplaas seem to have been let out and accorded great lifetime pensions in agreements that we don't know about. There are issues post the TRC, and I think Mathews Phosa was later involved in the process of trying to establish the basis for some prosecutions. There's a lot about that period that we don't know. What even the knowledge of that won't do, and I think we must continue the struggle for justice to be seen to be done. It won't return Chris Hani, but I think that at a moment like this, we've got to extract from his life the values that he lived by, because his was a life of example, and ask why that is in such short supply in the leadership of this country at the moment. The courageous, determined, rational leadership that persuades people about the future, that is what South Africa needs now more than ever, and that is the leaf that we must take from the book of the life of Chris Hani.
And I wonder if this inquest were to go ahead, and indeed speculation around links to his own comrades having been involved in his murder, what the implications thereof would be for the broader tripartite alliance, possibly.
Mkhototo, one can speculate, but that conjecture I don't think is going to lead us very far. What I'm saying is what we miss most is courageous, determined, collective leadership that can take South Africa to the next phase. I'd like to believe that should be the focus of all of us as South Africans. Continue to argue for the judicial inquiry, and I think Sidimpo did exceedingly well at this morning. Continue to argue for that, but I think the bigger issue for me is, why are there no people who want to live and lead as Chris did?
And you mentioned Dimpho Hani, the widow of the late Chris Hani, and she again spoke today of her pain, a sense of betrayal, if you will, at the Constitutional Court ordering late last year that the government or correctional services release Janusz on parole, and that has gone back to the conversation about the balance, does it not, of the weight of the crime committed, the pain and grief of the family, and the rights of the offender, which is what the court had said it wanted to balance. And I wonder how we balance that, especially in light of historic crimes, especially a crime such as this, that almost tipped this country into violence at a time when we were just on the eve of our democratic transition.
You know, the big issue is that courage may involve the absence of bitterness. I mean, I had contact with Chris from the time he came back. I was in awe of his leadership style. I knew of some of the things that he'd been through. I knew his family, especially his cousin Doreen in Kaimandi in Stellenbosch. We understood that kind of pain, but Chris wasn't led by bitterness. He was led by a vision of the future. And that is what I'm pleading for, that we focus on. Allow those processes to run, but bitterness will, I think, take us back to a place that would be very, very dark and not provide much hope for South Africans. And we need a generation that will live by hope and be led by hope and be determined by hope. And I think the spirit of Chris Hani looms large in constructing what that hope is about.
And lastly, sir, very briefly, can any of that happen without an inquest?
I don't think that the leadership of hope is dependent on the inquest. The inquest, I'm saying, must run its course. It must run its course. There must be a campaign to ensure that the truth will out. But if all of our leadership energy is sucked into the demand for an inquest, I think we'll see less and less available leadership to take this country from this place where we are to a nation state that inspires more people with hope, where more parents feel that hope and opportunity for their children are in this country.
Former Minister Trevor Manuel speaking to us on the anniversary of the assassination of SACP leader Chris Hani. Thank you so much for your time, sir.